You know how sometimes you come across something which instinctively you somehow recognize as being a fairly significant piece of the puzzle, even before you're even certain what the bigger puzzle even is? Well, that's how I felt when I first encountered a guy named Anthony Patch and his research into the occult agenda behind CERN's Large Hadron Collider in Switzerland. If you do a YouTube search for things like CERN and Saturn or CERN portal and such, you'll find lots of material that's been created on this subject. But Patch's take on it was one that really stood out from the rest. And the real interesting thing to me now is the timing of it all, since I started listening to interviews he's done on CERN roughly 6 to 9 months before encountering the flat earth topic. The first two videos I actually put up on my channel were made from excerpts from an Anthony Patch video, which I decided to make after being so fascinated by his exploration of the subject. But admittedly, the audio quality of those videos is really not great, and the music is too loud, so I've been wanting to revisit the whole topic of CERN ever since I started researching Flat Earth. Because the thing is, having these ideas which Patch talks about regarding CERN fresh in my mind, I think proved to really open my eyes to the kinds of possibilities we might have to consider when looking into the broader context of a truly biblical enclosed cosmology. I'm actually not sure if it all would have clicked in quite the same way, or at least not as quickly, had it not transpired in that order. Interestingly enough, the CERN-Saturn topic and the Flat Earth topic both seem to give a lot of insight into the other. The whole thing just started to fit in a way that was absolutely mind-blowing. Now, there are other folks out there who've also made these same connections between CERN and Flat Earth cosmology, the most notable one being a series of YouTube documentaries titled Flat Earth and Apollo's Key by the YouTuber Carol Ann, which are absolutely phenomenal and quite epic in their scope. So I'm not trying to compete with that by any means. I simply wanted to share a little bit about this whole arena of dot connecting and how it played a role in my own conceptualization of the broader Flat Earth topic from a biblical perspective. I'll leave links to those documentaries in the description, and I do encourage everyone to watch them if you haven't already. But for those who are not yet familiar with Anthony Patch and his conclusions on CERN, the nutshell version is this. First, Patch is not at all exploring the flat Earth angle, at least not yet. But interestingly enough, he is thoroughly sympathetic to the whole concept of the electric universe theory, and this plays a major role in his findings. In fact, he was the first place that I ever heard about the electric universe as being an alternative view to the gravitational model, and the first time I ever heard about things like the Thunderbolts project and so on. So even though he's still operating from within a completely Copernican heliocentric framework, the way that his postulations translate into an enclosed flat Earth cosmology is just astounding. Essentially, he believes that CERN is intended to use electrical fields and synchrotron energies to basically break through a dimensional veil and actually create an electrical plasma conduit between Earth and Saturn, which he believes to be a sort of hyperdimensional prison for a vast number of evil entities, which the occult-driven elites are working towards freeing from this prison. Now, that point alone was an intriguing thing for me to consider, since anyone who's rummaged through the various strains of occult mythology is likely quite familiar with how Saturn has always held such a central role in their worship and symbolism and everything. It gets you down the whole rabbit hole of the Saturn cube, and the black cube being a recurring occult symbol which connects to the six-pointed star, the seal of Solomon, and the idea of a spiritual prison, and so much more. Another thing that Patch talks a lot about is just the whole thematic interplay between the stars and the ancient pantheons of gods. And he even talks about the stars being, quote, plasma discharges in the heavens, which should really be quite eyebrow-raising to anyone who's been researching Flat Earth, especially since all the kinds of footage of stars we've now been seeing that captured using P900 cameras and everything. So like I said, the way that so much of what he talks about just translates right into a flat Earth cosmological perspective is just uncanny. But going back to Saturn, that was actually one of the pieces of Patch's theory, which still confused me when I was contemplating it from a conventional heliocentric viewpoint. I guess I just couldn't quite imagine why a spherical planet, essentially a big ball of gas millions of miles away in space, surrounded by an icy ring, would be the mechanism by which God would have apparently used to imprison all these rebellious spirits in, until the time of the end when they would be allowed to be released for a short time. I mean, it made a lot of sense in terms of it fitting into the occult side, but from a purely cosmological basis, it still seems pretty weird. But then, as I was sort of revisiting all these ideas through the lens of biblical flat Earth cosmology, whereby the sun and moon and stars are not millions of miles away in space, but all contained within the firmament, and these luminaries are connected to various angelical administrators in a much more literal way, and it just really started to blow my mind. This whole question of how the mystery schools have been fixated with the planets throughout history, and how they seem to regard them more as both spiritual realms and the principalities of those spiritual realms, suddenly came into more focus. There does just seem to be a reoccurring correlation between the wandering stars and the rebellious fallen angels. So this was, of course, incredibly interesting to then be thinking about Saturn from this new perspective, because honestly I'd been very curious for several years as to why this planet that God had supposedly made would even have that weird hexagon-shaped storm pattern swirling in opposite directions at its pole. I'd basically concluded that Satan had simply chosen to adopt this naturally occurring hexagon as a central component of his entire esoteric system for whatever reason. But with this fresh perspective, these new eyes and new angle of questioning all that we're taught about astronomy and NASA and everything else, I started taking a closer look at the alleged Saturn footage from things like the famous Cassini mission and such, and almost instantly began to scream of the same type of Hollywood fabrication as everything else. I mean, when you just stop and look at all these photos of the famous Saturn hexagon and the rest of the Cassini footage, which honestly is almost just too crisp and shot too gracefully, it just really starts to stretch the limits of credulity in my mind. These sequences of Saturn are allegedly pieced together from a series of still images from millions of miles away, and yet you watch it and it looks like an art film piece. To me, it even looks like it was shot on actual film. And when you compare how stunning these images are, taken a couple decades ago now, with the very recent and pitiful images of the moon transiting in front of the Earth that we've all seen and laughed at, I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. Plus, just like practically all the other NASA footage, aside from the Hubble paintings and the CGI created footage from the ISS, there are no stars in the background. And then when you look at these Cassini photos of what are claimed to be Saturn's moons, my gosh, it just becomes ridiculous. They honestly look like they were just made out of plaster of Paris. Just look at the lighting on some of these. Now, on this one you can actually see that the shadows of the craters go in different directions at a perpendicular angle to each other, which of course is impossible if this was indeed a moon being illuminated by the sun. These shadows basically show us that it's just a clay model in a dark room being lit by a bulb which apparently the photographer placed way too close to the prop. So it's another interesting flat Earth recalibration, for sure, to look at more of these kinds of things and consider the possibility that the three-dimensional spheres called planets have been hoaxed and rendered within the false materialistic evolutionary paradigm in order to essentially serve as a front for what is actually way more about higher spiritual dimensions and the New World Order's occult agenda that revolves around somehow transgressing the created order, piercing dimensional barriers, and ultimately even trying to succeed in escaping the firmament itself and ascending to the highest dimensional thresholds of heaven. I don't know how they might have exactly faked footage such as the famous swirling hexagon storm, but it is interesting to note that I was able to find this footage of a university experiment where they succeeded in replicating the same counter-revolving hexagon-shaped phenomenon in a lab. So, if a bunch of college students can figure out that much, it's not the hugest stretch to imagine what the elites might have been able to concoct with unlimited budgets. Anyhow, I just wanted to discuss this a little bit, as this was really one of those very interesting lines of research that helped kickstart a lot of my own exploration of the flat Earth cosmology topic, since ultimately, regardless of whatever specific details of Anthony Patch's research might turn out to be accurate, the bottom line for me is the realization that what we're really dealing with here when it comes to the whole New World Order agenda is a spiritual deception, a spiritual agenda. And by spiritual, we can indeed articulate this in terms of dimensions, and these dimensional aspects absolutely do have to do with the stars and planets and the whole false heliocentric globe paradigm that we've been spoon-fed. And it connects to the secret space program and the alien UFO deception, and it even connects to things like the internet and the mark for the beast and so on. The whole goal of Lucifer has always been to ascend to the highest heaven and dethrone God himself. And the Luciferian lie to mankind has always been that we too can ascend right along with him and become little gods ourselves. But it's all a doomed enterprise in the end. It's a deluded nightmare that Jesus himself will bring to an end when he fulfills the last prophecies of the Bible and everything is finally, completely put under his absolute authority. That's really the only winning ticket, guys. There's no sense in opposing the psychotic elites, the humans who are temporarily in control of the governments and military and media today, only to turn around and throw your lot in with the same fallen, lying spirit who's deceived all those misguided souls. Put your faith in Jesus, and there's nothing that the enemy can ever truly take away from you. Thank you.